Well, good morning, everyone. It is 8:30. We're going to start on time. Even though we just have 3 speakers in this session, I think just to reward everyone being here on time and for people to be able to switch, those of us or those who will join us online. So my name is Susie Moser. I get to be the chair on this lovely session. All focused on the human dimensions of resilience and which is the R in MR25. So I'm glad we're having that focus. We're going to have Amanda Stoltz start us off with a talk on environmental justice. And we're going to go for 15 minutes with each talks, maybe some clarifying questions right then and there. We'll switch, and then we have larger discussion at the end. So with plenty of time for that. So with no further ado, Amanda, may I call you up? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about a systematic literature review that I conducted alongside some colleagues at UC Santa Cruz. And I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Delaware Disaster Research Center with Airsiders. But yeah, this was one of my dissertation chapters. So really excited to share it all with you today. And just a week ago, we were accepted at Climatic Change, so the paper's currently in press. Very exciting. So I don't need to explain the definition of environmental justice to this group. I think we're all very aware of it, but started in the 1970s and essentially was focused mostly on pollution and waste dumping and urban communities. But that all changed in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And then we really saw this environmental justice conversation go from being about pollution and waste dumping to thinking about hazards, to thinking about things like storms and hurricanes and how those are disproportionately impacting marginalized communities. So now we've had, and that also coincided in the early 2000s with the climate justice movement, looking at climate change and how that is impacting people disproportionately. So now we've had 20 years of papers on environmental justice and on environmental justice on the coast. And it's a really ripe time to see what we've learned over that time period and to assess where there might be gaps and what the future of this literature is going to look like. So our literature review was really focused on how do we understand coastal hazards through a justice lens. So to do that, we used the search terms that you see on the screen and conducted a search in Web of Science and pulled scientific articles that came up, which gave us about 367 articles total. We pared that down to 194 articles, just focused on how coastal hazards impact marginalized populations. Overall, the work covered research from 38 countries. Most of the work is focused in the US, or most of the papers that came back in our review. And they're usually focused on urban locations. So a lot in Houston, Miami, New Orleans, New York City. And then we did find some gaps when we look at this geographic overview of the literature, namely that when you focus on the US, that Hawaii was only examined in one study. And there were only 3 studies looking at Alaska. And I don't know if y'all knew this, but the coastline of Alaska is actually longer than the entire combined coastlines of the other 49 states. So it does seem like a pretty big gap in the literature. And I should mention that we're just looking at scientific articles. So there's a ton of great literature, a ton of information on the really great work that's being done in these locations. But if you were a coastal hazard scientist and you were looking up papers on Web of Science, you wouldn't see all of it. So overall, the papers in the review show that the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable populations are the most at risk to the impacts of coastal hazards. And a lot of these papers are doing this pretty straightforward mapping approach where they're mapping the census data over the flood risk map. And they're saying, look, the minority populations or the marginalized populations are in the flood zone. And so I want to make a distinction here between exposure and vulnerability. But as you see, kind of the overall picture is we have this low-lying community and they're in the flood zone, and they're very exposed to coastal hazards. But they're also very vulnerable. They have boarded up windows, there's people living in tents, they don't have garages, there's no cars, they don't have flood insurance, and those factors make them very vulnerable to coastal hazards. At the same time, we have our house on the hill, which has some exposure to coastal hazards. They're near this eroding cliff, there's an incoming hurricane, but they do have flood insurance. They have a 2-car garage. The dad is friends with the mayor. They're working on building a seawall in front of their property, right? So all those things make them less exposed and less vulnerable to the coastal hazards, even though they're in a very similar location. And this isn't the picture on every single coast, but I see this time and time again. And even when I was doing research in Alaska and working with indigenous communities there, you have the indigenous community in the flood zone and then a mansion on the hill. So overall, when you look at what marginalized communities the literature focused on, you see a focus on economic vulnerabilities, and then, of course, race, age, gender, renters, and rural communities as well. And there's a lot more codes, there's a lot more information that I'm not presenting today, so just know that, just kind of talking about some of the main findings. But the main gaps here, two of the interesting gaps is only 5% of the papers talked about homeless populations or folks that were homeless before the coastal hazard occurred. A lot talking about people who are homeless after. And then only 1% of the papers talk about incarcerated populations. So those really do seem like some of the most marginalized, the most vulnerable populations, and they're not coming up in this review. And then I should also mention that these marginalized communities, their levels of marginalization are very contextual. So when you look at papers in the US that are talking about how women are affected by coastal hazards, they might say, oh, they're more economically vulnerable, or they might be single parents. But when you look at papers elsewhere where women face a lot more oppression, the marginalization becomes a lot more intense. So in a Sovakul et al. Paper about a 1991 hurricane in Bangladesh, a flood in Bangladesh, the death rate for women was 5 times the rate for men. And it was all due to religious taboos. They're not allowed to learn how to swim. They have less mobility about leaving the home. And so you can see how these levels, this is very contextual. So when you think about vulnerabilities, it's very important to note that marginalized populations aren't intrinsically vulnerable to coastal hazards. It's these factors that make them more vulnerable. And overall, the papers are really focused on these economic vulnerabilities. So just living in a place with weaker infrastructure or having a lack of education, less shelter, less transportation options. And then there's also 40% of the papers that talk about less representation in government and institutions, which is really important if you think about the procedural dimension of environmental justice and who's involved in making the decisions that would decrease these vulnerabilities, decrease these exposures. And then also just less information, less access to aid. And so these three kind of the top vulnerabilities that are mentioned, they're often combined in a way that can perpetuate the injustices that we see on the coast. And one paper from Taylor in 2022 looked at just a really good example of this in Charleston. They have proposed building a 9-mile seawall around Charleston that stops right at the majority Black low-income communities, the Charleston Neck communities. So you can see how these folks were not involved in that process. They did not have a seat at the table. They weren't able to talk to the city about how they're already experiencing flooding, about how they have crumbling infrastructure problems. And so there's a distrust of government as well. And you can see all these factors kind of join together in that way. So I've mentioned kind of the difference between vulnerability and exposure. And if these are the ways in which communities are more vulnerable to coastal hazards, what makes marginalized communities more exposed? And that's often due to historical and current systems of oppression. During this conference, we've been talking about resettlement, land reuse, buyouts, and all of those are deeply intertwined with legacies of racism and colonialism. And overall, the papers, less than half, only 40% actually use any of these terms in the paper. So they're talking about environmental justice, but they're kind of leaving out the discourse on justice. And a couple examples of the papers that do, really clear example from Austin, Texas, that shows that the periodic flooding was a factor in segregation of the city. So these black and brown dots are Black and Mexican households, and you can see they're just located right in that floodplain. And then also slavery, which is only mentioned in 5% of the papers. We just looked at the papers in the US. It's something that, we think of happening, having a long history, having been a long time ago, but it still deeply influences where people live today, such as the descendants of the Gullah Geechee people who are facing extreme flood risk. So when you don't say the reasons why marginalized communities are more exposed to coastal hazards, you're leaving the reader to assume that this relationship is exogenous at best, or at worst, the fault of the marginalized communities themselves. And that can serve to further victimize these populations and also create mistrust between the researchers and the communities that they study. And I know what you may be thinking, environmental justice, are we still doing that? Are we still writing these papers in this current ecosystem that we're in? And I would say that yes, and we're gonna do it better. Because when we're not using environmental justice, when we're censored, when we're not allowed to use this umbrella term, we're pushed into being very specific about what we are talking about. And that using these terms, talking about the actual injustice issues, is more accurate and it's more meaningful. So overall, there are a number of solutions that are mentioned by these papers of, what do we do about injustice on the coast? And I'm just going to talk about 3 of them. The first solution is one that us scholars and researchers love to say, oh, we just need to learn more. We need more research. And that's 50%, 56% of the papers. But these papers also talk about the importance of practitioners knowing more and knowing more about their communities and being more involved with their communities as well. The second solution, monetary solutions, thinking of direct payments or climate reparations, and you think that this would be mentioned in a lot of papers given the focus that I mentioned on economic vulnerabilities. But this is only 15% of the papers mention these monetary solutions. So you think that maybe if the problem is that people are in poverty, helping people out of poverty would be the solution to this problem, but it's often not mentioned in these scientific papers. And then the third solution is thinking of more transformative solutions, like recognizing indigenous sovereignty and thinking of how to think of the ocean as a common pool resource, or deprivatizing the adaptation process and trying to actually solve some of these systemic issues. And that's only 5% of the papers in the review. So I think you might agree with me that these solutions don't really seem to match the problems. So we have some recommendations for researchers and practitioners. For researchers, just as I said before, you can't write a coastal justice paper without writing about justice. And so thinking about, it doesn't have to be this, it doesn't have to be a humanities paper, but just mentioning these terms, using these terms, being specific about what we're talking about, very important. Also acknowledging the limitations of using census data. Some of these papers, especially when you think about papers that look at Hispanic populations, it's very different whether you're talking about rich Cubans in Miami versus Mexican immigrants in Texas. Those are going to be very different groups of people, but some of these papers still compare them like the same group. And then considering avenues for actually decreasing the vulnerabilities to hazards and addressing some of these issues in the first place. And then for practitioners, it's very important that they take account of social groups that are likely to be excluded So thinking about where are the nursing homes, where are the low-income groups, are they being involved in the evacuation process? Do they have the information that they need? And then also improving the collection and the accessibility of data and information related to those communities. So as we saw, there's a lack of papers that talk about homeless populations. And one of the reasons why that is, the census data is accessible and it's open to the public. We have that information, but I could draw you a map of where the homeless communities in my neighborhood live. And if that was online and available, I think researchers would use it. And also creating space for marginalized groups to participate in the decision-making process. So as we saw with the Seawall example in Charleston and a number of other examples, really thinking about the procedural element of justice and making sure that people are being involved throughout this process, being compensated to be involved as well. And then also just addressing some of those systemic and structural drivers so that we don't see the injustices continue to perpetuate. So with that, I just want to leave y'all with this idea that as our coastal ecosystems undergo irreversible ecological transformation, so should our social systems. Thank you.
Any clarifying questions for Amanda before we go to the next talk? Yes, in the corner.
Amanda.
Hi, Sydney.
Hi, Sydney Fishman, Washington Sea Grant. I wondered, maybe I just missed this, but language access and non-English speaking populations, did that come up a lot in your research, or maybe that wasn't as common in the literature?
No, that's, oh yeah. So the question is non-English speaking and non-English as a first language. We also coded for folks who, since it was a global review, people who don't speak the majority language. And yeah, that's a very, it's a common thing that's brought up in the literature because it's tied directly to having access to information. And when the information isn't in Spanish or the information isn't in other languages, especially for groups that are very predominant in an area, that can be a huge barrier and a huge cause of some of these harms.
Carol, question, what about people living with disabilities?
Yeah, disabilities as well, but less common. Disabilities is often tied to age and mobility and thinking about folks who are disabled in the way that they might not be able to evacuate, but other disabilities where it's not mentioned very much in the research at all.
More questions?
Yeah, sort of following up from that, although it wasn't explicitly included in your search terms, how often were immigrant or migrant populations represented in the
Yeah, also much lower than the other groups, but in the U.S. But definitely thinking we had a lot of papers on climate migration as well, and thinking about that, very relevant to this conference.
It wasn't clear to me in your list of isms that are talked about whether capitalism is identified as a primary driver of where people are able to live.
Yeah, so the question is whether capitalism is one of the isms in that list, and it was. Yeah, it's lower on the list, but capitalism and also neoliberalism as part of some of the systemic drivers of some of these harms did appear in the literature. Also lower than the 20% of papers that talk about systemic racism, which was kind of the highest ism in the review.
Awesome, thanks. I have a question. You recognized gaps in Hawaii and Alaska, but I was wondering if it wasn't because of the indigenous populations there and the ways that hazards intersect with sovereignty struggles. And so like if you search for traditional ecological knowledge, would you find more papers about justice in those locations?
Yeah, I think that would be a more expansive review, and we would get more of those papers looking at Alaska, looking at Hawaii and indigenous populations if we included traditional ecological knowledge as a search term. But we were really focused in on, if you're a coastal hazard researcher, you're going on Web of Science and you're looking for papers on environmental justice, what are you going to find? And it's very interesting that you do not come up with those papers, even though they're focused on working with Indigenous populations, and they're doing the work, and they're a really important part of solving these issues.
Okay, one last question and then we're gonna switch.
Hi, Nicole Beaker, Integral Consulting. More of a secondary question, but I was curious if you and your team looked at the authors of these papers, and I know you were specifically narrowed down to academic level research, and I was curious if you looked at which institutions, what level of funding they have, the race of the authors, genders of the authors, if you've looked at anything like that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think the most interesting finding that we had related to authorship was the folks who are citing each other. So we're able to do a map and see which of these papers are citing each other. And when you look at that, you find that there's this, this core group of like 20% of the papers that are all citing one another. And then writ large, a lot of these papers are being published in a vacuum. So like people are just doing census data and spatial mapping, calling an environmental justice paper and publishing it, and not interacting with the broader literature, which we thought was kind of an additional thing that we learned about how this literature has been done over the past 20 years.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're gonna switch to an online presenter. Julia Blocher, who will speak on human mobility related loss of social resilience and cohesion.
So thank you, Julia, for joining us. You're muted right now.
Yeah, hello, good morning, everyone. Greetings from Berlin. I'm very sorry I could not be there in person with you. It's just not the absolute best time of year to travel to New York as much as I would have loved to. But thanks for having me online. Can I just confirm you can see my slides, but not the notes, or what do you see?
Yes.
Super.
Okay. You're all set, Julia. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm really happy to join you today. I am a project lead and scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, which is a think tank just outside of Berlin, working on especially climate issues, but broader environmental issues in general. And I'm happy to be here today to present some of the findings from the recently concluded Habitable project, which was, as you may have heard of it, I hope you have, it was a 4.5-year project funded by the European Commission, the largest research project to ever have been funded by the European Union on climate-related migration and displacement. We had 22 partners in 18 countries, and over those years, we really did a lot of interesting research on many, many different topics. But today, I'm wanting to focus a bit on the interlinkages between migration, habitability, and social resilience as the, whoa, something just fell off of my desk. I apologize. So as the title of my talk may have indicated, I'm focusing on one of the pieces of work, which was really about social resilience and community cohesion. For that, I'm going to focus on the data that we collected qualitatively between 2022 and 23. So this was purposive sampling in 6 countries. And what we really were trying to achieve overall with this research was to inform policy on climate-related mobility in the countries in which we're working, but also, of course, have a kind of broader influence on the environment migration field and policy therein. So I did want to just say up front that the project has concluded, and so we have put all of the data sets and some of the key reports, including the project synthesis report, are all online on our repository. So we would be delighted if any of you, or perhaps master's students, PhD students, would like to go and use this data, including the survey data that we collected in 5 countries, as well as the qualitative data that I'm going to present today. So just to say a little bit of what I wanted to cover, first of all, looking at the concept of habitability and why I bring this to this conference. Then I'll provide some of the insights from the empirical work, although we are still really sorting through a lot of the data at this point. And then time permitting, just to offer some concluding thoughts. So coming first to the concept of habitability. So we, in the motivations for the Habitable Project, we were looking into what are some of the adverse environmental and climatic events that are related to individual decisions to move away from affected areas, as well as communities moving away. We've seen in previous projects so-called ghost cities in India and China, where a critical mass of people have left to such an extent that it makes it difficult for people who are remaining behind to actually lead a dignified life in those places. So we, in this project, saw in the literature that these decisions to move away from affected areas are heterogeneous over time. We also know that from the example of Hurricane Katrina that was mentioned earlier. And the reason for this heterogeneity is that the decision to move is really shaped by these intersecting social, economic, and cultural factors that really vary considerably within and across communities. So this is related to the point at which people perceive that the uninhabitability of the place, at least what we saw in this research, is not just about the biophysical space in which people are surviving, but also about the social and structure factors that create a place embedded with human meanings and in which communities can live together and thrive. So we conceive of this perceived decrease in the habitability of a place as being likely leading to increased outmigration over time, which will probably have heterogeneous effects. And we can dive deeper into different case study examples. But really the point is that people in a community are interdependent and interconnected. And when one household reaches their limits to adaptation and place, it does affect the other households around them. So just to say that our definition of habitability that we applied in this paper is that it's the social, cultural, economic, and environmental factors that shape the suitability of a place to support human life and livelihoods. And we tried to break that down into three kind of dimensions: the ability to survive, or otherwise said human security, as the IPCC calls it. Secondly, livelihood sustainability in the sense of the sustainable livelihoods approach developed by Schoons and others. And then this component of social resilience, that's what I'm going to focus on today, that we're developing this concept based on Neil Adger and others looking at that. So coming to these three dimensions, that I just want to say, if you're interested in the other two that I won't talk about today, we did publish a paper on this this year that you can find in Global Environmental Change. So the social resilience side of habitability, Adger defines this as the level of a social structure, like a community or a village, that's made up of dynamic structures of livelihoods, access to resources, and social institutions. So in our project language, we define social resilience as the ability of a community to withstand adverse events, external events, and external stresses without surpassing that critical threshold for habitability. So we understand social resilience as a flexible and really interdisciplinary concept. We like that it's in climate-focused language. We can bring it to climate discussions. And then we set out really to apply it in our case study areas with a focus on those, the strength of the social institutions, as well as the social limits to adaptation. So now coming a bit to the empirics, we conducted interviews in 6 case study countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and then Thailand is kind of a counterexample. In the end, we verified and processed 652 interviews in origin areas and 103 interviews in destination areas. And these were semi-structured interviews translated into local languages. The interview participants were selected on the basis of project-wide criteria together with the local partners. And we used a mainly critical case sampling method. So in this project, my role was as methods lead and trying to find kind of some coherence and comparability across the different countries. So all in all, we then had all these interviews translated, and then we analyzed them together with the case study with the country teams. I think you can see also the link to the database here. Now coming to this social resilience question a little bit, one of the key points that we tried to work on in the 2-cycle coding and analysis we did a 2-cycle coding for content and sentiment. And the interviewees in our study sites really largely confirmed that existing research showing that there are a certain number of things in the case study areas that are really essential to address basic needs, but also that they would be together as a community, things that are affecting the community over time. And the prevalence of people saying that climatic changes and environmental changes more broadly have caused a decline in their surrounding environments was really overwhelming. It was a vast majority of people who mentioned this to us. But we also wanted to get some nuance about well-being as reported by the interviewees. So while, of course, the perceptions of well-being about the changes that are facing them. So the majority of people saying that, sorry, my internet connection's unstable apparently. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. Go back.
Okay.
We're gone for a minute.
Okay, I'll turn off my video maybe just in case, and then return in the later. So as you can see from this graph here, we had most people in our sample suggesting that their well-being over the past 10 years had either stagnated or in most cases declined over time, except for in the case of Thailand, where people are apparently a little bit more optimistic. So when we further interrogated the reasons for why do you think that your well-being has declined over time, people really described a loss of livelihood, changing economic and environmental conditions, job loss, and so on. But a number of people also described the breaking down of social bonds, suggesting that community-based coping mechanisms have declined in recent years, and also suggesting that there's competition has increased, jealousy increased, and so on. So I go now to another graph trying to further show this. So a number of people actually described to us, and this is what I think is an advantage of a qualitative approach in this case, some really specific and narrative stories about some people in the community receive food aid or cash aid, and those are only the very poor people, whereas middle income people don't have those same advantages. And so this is prompting jealousy over time, according to our interviewees. We saw basically most people suggesting that, of course, the broader local conditions are responsible for their decline in well-being over time, but a number of people really specifically talked about loss of neighborly feelings, different types of land user groups are not getting along as well as they used to, and things like this. So I wanted to also bring just a few interview quotes to this conversation. In this case, looking at some of the positive impacts of migration as compared to the negative ones. And I just provide just maybe one thing that I read out loud where you see the bottom right corner, this quote was from a male interviewee in Kenya, who said that there are things that happen at home, but because the migrant is far away, I find it difficult to do whatever I feel should be done. Mobile phones are not very good at building a family where there is inconsistent communication. So in this case, really showing us that due to the alienation of families as a result of migration, a lot of people felt that this is reducing their family bonds over time. So we came up with a kind of conceptual model for this, a link of habitability, migration, and social resilience. And so what we understand is that the perceived uninhabitability of a place, at least as interpreted by the interviewees that we spoke to, can lead to outmigration over time, but this has a both positive and negative impacts on social resilience. There can be an increase in social cohesion or social resilience that makes the place more livable for the people who are there. In other words, it decreases the perceived uninhabitability of a place. While climate change and environmental changes maybe more broadly come as kind of an external force affecting multiple or all households in the area, and causing declines of habitability over time. If we consider all of these relationships and feedbacks, it would be really kind of conceivable that as the livability of a place or of a space becomes less and more important, that the habitability is declining over time, more and more people migrate out. This will have kind of knock-on effects of declining social resilience, and they enter in sort of a downward spiral in which eventually a critical mass of people feel that they have to leave this place, that the social institutions, the ability to rely on one another has declined over time, and at the same time, the geographical space and options for livelihoods have declined as well as a result of climate impacts. So just to kind of sum this up a little bit, we think that social resilience and its contributions to the perceived habitability of a place is maybe variably undermined and also built through human mobility and migration processes. This geographic and social alienation of people kind of, this is why I put this down arrow here. This alienation of people contributes to the erosion of social connectedness, the erosion of cultural identity, kinship ties, extended family networks, and these processes of enculturation that we know are really key to social cohesion and community cohesion. And this is also especially relevant to climate change because these social institutions that are custodian to traditional titles and family lands means also that this is custodian to the management of resources, which especially in rural and agricultural contexts means that people are less able to face climate change in the future. And the breakdown of these social institutions can engender further risks to the communities as we continue to experience exacerbated environmental degradation. On the other hand, and this is why I have a sort of positive arrow pushing up on the balance, there are also positive aspects of human mobility that we see has the potential to increase social resilience over time and perhaps prepare communities for adverse events in the future. We all know it's pretty well established in the literature that when the origin household invests in sending a migrant, especially to work in a higher wage sector, there's this kind of implied investment that the migrant will then return remittances and probably also some knowledge and skills as well. And the execution of this social contract can also actually encourage the family to stay together closer and so on. So in this sense, migration can be positive for social bonds. Just 1 second. And then, of course, I already mentioned the role of social remittances, which is a little bit trickier, but the literature suggests this is also important. So overall, we think this question of social resilience sort of exists on a spectrum with different forces increasing or decreasing habitability of a place over time. And climate-related mobility processes are really part and parcel of this in nonlinear ways, if I can say it like that. So maybe I'll just skip to my concluding thoughts, which is really overall.
A couple minutes maybe to wrap up.
Yeah, no, I'm wrapping up. So I think I would have loved to present a little bit more specifically the paper that we're writing on the social resilience question. But we are still working on that. What we would like to do is dive a bit deeper into some of the narratives from our interviews that really explicitly address this question. And we are also still working on comparing what we saw from the qualitative interviews with what we see from the quantitative work. But I think that this question of habitability is a useful concept, not just in academia, but also in connecting the research on climate migration to policy, because for a few reasons. So first of all, it allows us to kind of connect this much larger dimension of climate change, which is at large geographic scales. Global climate models don't do a good job of downscaling and so on, and connect all of that to much, much more context-specific and even household-specific reasons for why people move or return and so on over time. This concept also really allows us to pinpoint, at a sense, the difference between forced and voluntary movements, which still is a dichotomy that exists in the policy. And if we're better able to describe and identify what what habitability is, it will also allow us to better address how to support habitability and ensure that places over time remain habitable, remain livable, where people and communities can thrive. So thank you so much for your time. I would like to really also highlight that my main co-author for this is Dr. Diogo Serralho and others at the Potsdam Institute. And again, that you can find a couple of the reports and the data sets online, and we hope to have the paper as well soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Julia. So we would love to see your face again. And if there are any clarifying questions in the audience for you, then let's do those now before we hear the third paper. And then if you can stay on, I don't know if you can, for a discussion among the authors and with the audience at the end. So any clarifying questions for Julia? Yes, there's one. Hang on a second. We're bringing the...
Hi, Julia. Thank you. I wonder if you can clarify whether the term social tipping point, which comes from a different type of literature on systems and systems analysis, is a concept that you would consider as encompassing of the 3 dimensions that you presented to us today, including social resilience.
Are we taking one question at a time, or?
Yeah, just go ahead. Go ahead. And
okay. Yes, Andrea, thank you very much for the question. So actually, social tipping points was one of the key motivations for the project, as I hope came clear from my presentation. And we're sort of borrowing this concept from the systems analysis world and from more physical sciences. And we do kind of consider it that way. So in the sense that what we were expecting to see is that gradual changes in environmental factors would at some point lead to a systems shift in the migration ecosystem, if I can call it like that, where we thought in particular that we would see after a certain point, migration rates would not just increase over time in a linear fashion, but we would see a jump in out-migration. And I didn't present that really today, but we actually did find that. So first of all, that we looked at the effect of shocks over time in a cumulative manner and saw that even if people choose not to leave a place after a few minor income loss shocks or perhaps minor droughts and so on, but then when people face severe shocks or this accumulation of shocks over time, at some point people decide that they can no longer live where they are. That was the result of a regressions analysis, so we can't really say what is the reason why people decided that that was the time. So this is why we also did this qualitative research. And with the survey data from the Habitable Project, the team at the University of Exeter that was leading in that work conducted a regressions discontinuity analysis looking at temperature anomalies and also rainfall anomalies, and finding that at a certain point, we do see a non-linear jump in out-migration as a result of temperature increase in, I think, 2 of the 5 countries where the analysis was conducted. So I can't speak too much to that because I wasn't specifically part of that analysis, but I would say that the goal of this project was to borrow some of these concepts from other areas of work and then try to integrate that social dimension and a much deeper understanding of people's perceptions and how they are experiencing the environmental changes around them, and not just looking solely at the big picture.
Thanks, Julia. There was one raised hand online. Andrea, are you still there and would like to ask you a question?
I think she's the one who just asked the question, perhaps.
Oh,
No,
there's
this was
2.
somebody here in the audience.
Sorry, there's 2
sorry.
Andreas. No, it's okay.
Yeah, Andrea.
Sorry, I tried to put it in the Q&A too. I'm not sure if that was better. I just had a question if you could explain the starburst in your diagram sort of midway through your presentation. I just wasn't sure which factors were included in the, do you remember the sort of burst
Sure.
shape?
Yes, I think so. So we did for the purpose of this presentation, I wanted to make a very simple kind of visual of the conceptual model that we're working on for the linkages between habitability, social resilience, and migration, really out migration. And so for me, the starburst was the external influence of climate impacts. So you have, let's say, within the community, already pre-existing reasons why people are facing vulnerabilities, pre-existing reasons why people migrate, and probably also pre-existing migration corridors. And then we have this kind of external influence of external shocks like droughts and floods, and so that then influence those factors and probably lead to mostly out migration, at least from what I saw in the fieldwork. That people were saying things like there was this very, very severe drought that led to a massive loss of livestock, and that's when we decided we had to leave, or that one person from the family had to leave, for example.
Great. Any other burning questions right now, just for clarification? Okay, then I want to bring up our next speaker, and if you can stay on, Julia, that would be wonderful. Then we can have conversation at the end for all of us together. So we have Ray Zimmerman, who will speak to us this morning, and I will tell you what the title of her talk is. Human Behavior Shaping Mobility for Disaster Resilience.
That slideshow, yeah.
We're gonna go
There
there you go.
And then I just do page down, yeah. Oh,
like to
great.
as well.
Okay. Good morning, early morning. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about today is the basically the intersection of hazards, behavior, and mobility, which is the which is the theme of the one of the themes of the conference, and basically hazards sets the stage, and building on what the previous speakers have mentioned, they're almost like shocks that people will react to. Behavior is human behavior is shaped by hazards, and I talk about multiple levels, and then these fit into mobility, many kinds of mobility, not only the movement of people, but the movement of services and goods as well. And I'm going to race through a number of these. These are in the abstract, but the bolded ones are the ones I'm going to talk about briefly. But what I wanted to really introduce is this is published every year by NOAA, and it's every kind of climate anomalies, hurricanes, floods, but primarily what I'm going to talk to is heat. Running through one of them, the North Carolina famous flooding, September of 2024. What we're dealing with was a very unusual location, record-breaking rains, portions attributed to climate change, heavily saturated soil conditions. That was the kicker. You add more rain into that and you've had it. A lot of damage to infrastructure, mobility, people couldn't get out. Just moving ahead to temperature, not only did we have a historic 2024 period, but look back at these graphs NOAA produces, you see them, the escalating temperature change over time. The third case here, the California wildfires, only looking at 24 to 25, except there was a historic one. The historic one was back in 2020 that occurred, and the August complex fire was considered the largest. But what you see, they use California fire uses 3 criteria: destructive, largest, deadliest. And I also tabulated what was due to electrical. Some people say it's mostly human causes. enough is due to electrical lines where there's an intersection between the hazard and the infrastructure. And this is a map that USGS basically has provided in terms of the a burn severity map. And this was the very old one before the 24-25 period, August 2020, August complex. Moving ahead, Superstorm Sandy, or whatever you want to call it, tropical storm, very unusual in terms of the area and wind damage. It took the lower left here, took a dramatic, unexpected left turn, which created a lot of the damage. You had a lot of precipitous increase in wind speed, drop in pressure, and all of these things. And over on the right, you see storm surge. That's what really did a lot of the damage. You know, and NOAA defines that as a rise in water generated by a storm above normal. And basically, you had 9-foot storm surges in New York City, and it coincided with the approximate time of the astronomical tide and so forth. And here you have electric power intersection with the storm conditions. And this actually compares Sandy in 2012 to the one Irene right before it. And it goes by state, and there was a recovery, eventually the restoration time. Blizzards, we just did a few years ago a study with the city of Buffalo. Our university had this project, I was involved in it, on the blizzard of December 22, 23 of 2022. Unusual, 80-mile-an-hour hurricane force winds, lasted 37 hours. We didn't know where the infrastructure was to dig everybody out. It was timed at Christmas when everybody was going on vacation. Here we looked at electric power infrastructure. Again, very unusual. The picture provided by National Grid, they had one side of the substation open because to cool the equipment, and that's where the storm came in, and it fell. The substations just fell apart and couldn't do anything. And on the right side of that is Buffalo over time compared to Erie County. Accidents, moving ahead from natural hazards to accidents. By the way, I didn't mention ice extent, which is a big thing that NOAA has tracked, precipitous decline in the extent of ice, and I can't go into that now. But accidents, electric power has a tremendous implication for other infrastructures. You knock out one distribution substation, this is Homeland Security's report, and it reverberates throughout. Here's the blackout report, the US-Canada power system outage in 2003. Here, the communication system went down. There were a simple tree, it's like O'Leary's cow and knocking over in the Chicago fire. You know, you had a tree hitting a line. They weren't aware visually and audibly that an alarm went off. And it's an excellent report if you can, but get the one that's several hundred pages, and that's good. And there were tripping of lines, cascading, multiple plants tripped for different reasons, and this is all outlined in the report. They suspected a cyber attack, which is an area that I study quite a bit as well, but that they couldn't really track that well. Now, look below. We just finished a big NSF project on underground infrastructure. It's not that everything happens above ground. We think we're safe underground. No, there are a lot of electrical fires, chemical corrosion, moisture, earth movement. There's a lot going on. You've got distribution and transmission lines that are interwoven, interlaced underground. Here are some pictures that I was able to take, except that The one on the upper right, courtesy of New York City Environmental Protection, that was unbelievable. You had a water main, the one with the fire, had a water main break, street collapse, a gas pipeline was cut by the street collapsing, and a fire occurred. Cars went down into the hole and the like. And the bottom one is something I was walking along Riverside Drive in Manhattan, drainage problems, and you've got a sink right into the infrastructure. Now, the second level, very, very important behavior. This goes back to the work of Baruch Fischhoff's group and Paul Slovic in 2000. You've got 5 dimensions. I won't have time to go through all of these, but attitudes, perceptions, then other things like experience, human needs and preferences, collaboration, population and development. But here are a few attributes. People want control. They want to be voluntarily exposed. They want things that are familiar. Other things, anchoring previous beliefs, experiences shape attitudes, and they're less skilled with numbers. Some people are less skilled with numbers. There are a lot of things that feed in, but there are human needs as well. Abraham Maslow actually came up with this. It's been applied many places. Safety and security all the way down to aesthetics and equity, but these things are really reordered. And that's what people need. And collaboration, this was actually out of one of the previous Columbia conferences that I did. Many ways that people can come together, ranging from all the way from protest, which is very active, to simply sitting in a room at a public hearing. Many ways people can come together. And then finally, urbanization, people are driving that to some extent. They're, there's kind of a back and forth, but increasing urbanization is occurring largely because of where people want to move, can move, and the like, both in the US and globally. Refer you to the World Bank, United Nations, and the Census Bureau. Third, we get to mobility. All of this contributes to mobility by mode. And again, what is modal choice? It's all about, no action. You can delay your travel, change the mode, the route, the time of travel, the mix, the combinations. I did a paper on the World Trade Center in New York collapse, and people changed their mode of travel. They walked, then there were ferries, there were buses, and then the subways finally came back. There's a mixed modal situation, and it depends on what the hazards are people are checked with. You go back to the Buffalo snowstorm, people ignored travel bans. They just got in their car. People want control, and that's what shapes their behavior. And there were a lot of accidents. I refer you to our blizzard report. Very few available high lifts, plow trucks to get people out of this. And then Hurricane Sandy, same thing. Mobility obstacles, whether you're talking about transit, the gas stations being out of gas, and submerged vehicles as well. And this is Hurricane Sandy. The light gray in MTA's map refers to the lines that were out. And here, everything comes together. Hurricanes. This is one example that you can use with the map maker. Hurricanes, population density and roads, bad mix. Okay. And then finally, I want to say that the whole point of this is that they drive each other. They are integrated, and that's what makes all the difference. The hazards and behavior, people often move to vulnerable areas, for example, subject to flooding or whatever, and fires more recently. And then the hazards can reduce or enhance infrastructure performance. And then finally, we get to mobility shaped by hazards and behavior. And if we don't act right here, we're going to compromise our resilience. And this is what we want to do. One thing you have to remember here is that the social systems encompassed in behavior really can take a lot longer to adjust than physical systems. Although some engineers may argue with that it takes a long time to build things, and mobility can vary in time and space. And so you really need to look at these three together. And there are references on my resume and, in the various publications I cited. And I acknowledge our NSF project on underground infrastructure, and also the Buffalo blizzard report that we did in 2022 through the NYU Wagner School. And again, classic disclaimer. Okay.
Thank you very much.
So as before, let's start with clarifying questions for Ray. And I'll check online in a moment here. In the room. Okay, let me check online. Are there any questions online? Maybe you can just unmute yourself. All right, so let's open it up to conversation among the authors or any broader questions about societal resilience. Feel free to take your seat and we'll just come around with a microphone if you have questions, broader questions. Maybe I can start us off with a question that sort of related thank you, that connects a little bit what Julia wrote about and what you, Amanda, were talking about. I'm wondering, Julia, if you could say a little bit about whether you analyzed who is moving and who is able to stay longer in their places, whose social cohesion, if you will, is being disrupted first and most. Did you sort of recognize an environmental justice element in the data that you saw?
Thanks. Thanks very much for that question. It gives me a great opportunity to talk about some of the research I wasn't able to present. I do want to first kind of back up a little bit and say that when I say human mobility, I think I'm saying something slightly different than the last presenter, because what I mean by human mobility is in the sense of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change refers to human mobility as migration, displacement, and planned relocations. And then we're increasingly talking about immobility as part of human mobility, so people who are not able to move even if they would like to. So when I say mobility, I don't mean people moving in their daily life, through public transport and such. So just to clarify that, because maybe I didn't really define.
Hang on, Julia, hang on, we're getting.
Can you not hear me?
Hang on. There's an emergency. Hang on 1 second. It's just about the elevator, so I don't think. Okay. So go on. We can now we can't use the elevators. That was the message. So never mind.
Oh, okay. Sorry, because I could not
mobility.
Hear
the very micro scale mobility is inhibited. So go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Okay, super. So we did throughout the Habitable project really try to the extent possible include gender and social equity dimensions in all phases of the research. So we had, a balance of people in the research team, of research participants. We struck almost in all countries except for Mali, 50-50 men and women division between the interviewees. So then when we started kind of subsetting the data and looking at this, what we really found out in the census is that there are different people within households who are less able to use migration strategies in a large sense, including migration as an adaptation strategy. So especially women, of course, elderly people, and people who are lower status within the household. So I'm thinking of like the youngest brother as compared to the oldest brother. We did some analysis on adaptation strategies and which communities maybe have a larger breadth of strategies at their disposal. You know, some people living closer to cities are more likely to be able to use, you know, short-term wage labor as a way to supplement the household income. People who are in much more remote areas are less likely to do that. We looked at, for example, connectivity to a local market. So you know, people who are farther away from markets tend to have less opportunities for short-term income supplements because they have to rely on middlemen rather than going to a cooperative with their crops. And so we also looked at we asked everybody, a lot of people or everybody, to give us ideas of how they would adapt in the future if these kind of events were to continue to occur. And what we saw was that by and large, women were more able to come up with more ideas for the future. So in a sense, you could say that they had a higher adaptive capacity because they are, you know, more proactive in a sense. But then when we asked them similarly, well, which of these have you been able to employ in the past? Women were much less likely to have actually been able to employ those strategies in the past. So if you follow my logic here, it means that women, even if their adaptive capacity may be high, their ability to adapt proactively is low. So who did we find migrating? Mostly working age men, and who do we find is more likely to be left behind are the women in particular gender roles, especially in countries like Mali, where capacities for women to manage household resources and make decisions are lower than in other contexts, and also elderly people who, of course, for other reasons, are less likely to be able to employ adaptive strategies, including migration. Sorry for the very long answer.
No, that's great. Thank you. You guys want to respond to it? Amanda, do you have a comment on that as well? Did you find anything specific in terms of who got to go and who got left behind?
Yeah, I'd like to first be a little more specific about some of the questions I was asked earlier. Susie asked me a question of how many of the papers talk about disabilities, and that was 23% of the articles. And then as well as Cindy's question about immigrants and folks who English as a second language. 16% of the papers talk about immigrants and 14% on English as a second language. And while the review was not focused on adaptation strategies, because often when you're looking at these EJ papers, they kind of they'll list a range of adaptation strategies, but not focus on them. And then there were some papers that were focused on managed retreat and mobility. And some of the really interesting things that we found there was this idea of retreat and return, which is where folks are either forced out of an area or there's enough climate gentrification that they have to leave an area because they can't afford it anymore. And they're pushed out into a relocated area that does not have the resources that they need to survive. It doesn't have a school, or it doesn't have a hospital, or it doesn't have access to the same fishing locations that they used before. So they end up returning to the hazardous area they were in before, which has now gotten even more hazardous because they don't have the same infrastructure that they had. And so this was kind of a theme that we saw overall of this theme of climate gentrification. And, you know, when you think about mobility and buyouts in this country, it looks a lot different in other areas where there is forced displacement and people who are pushed out of areas that they've lived for a very long time.
Also embodied in that sort of box of behavior elements is a huge amount on the social and economic characteristics, you know, of people and how their behavior definitely does differ in terms of the social psychological dimensions. You know, they want control, they have more experience, etc. And that's all in that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Other questions in the room? Or do you see any online? Okay. Yes.
Hello, Nicole again. My question is for Julia. On one of your slides, you had a point stating that there is a false dichotomy between forced and voluntary relocation, and I was wondering if you could expand more on that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the part where when I'm in presentations, especially with policy actors, I tend to say, well, there's continues to be a disconnect between the research and the policy, because when we're in the policy world, you have a very strong distinction between forced movements that tend to be then categorized as either internally displaced persons, and then you can relate to the soft law instruments on internally displaced persons, the guiding principle on internal displacement, which came out, I think, 1998. Or we're talking about conventional refugees in the sense of the 1951 Geneva Convention. And then when we're talking about voluntary migrants, then we're looking at people who are moving for economic
Julia,
reasons.
I'm so sorry. Can you pause for 1 second?
Oh, okay.
Elevators can be used again.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Oh,
Please
thank
continue.
goodness. I was really worried about the elevator situation. So I'm glad.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, or because I can't hear any announcement coming from the room?
Yes,
so.
we're all set. Go ahead.
Okay, super. Yeah, so you can see in the policy sphere, you have people who are addressing economic migrants, basically, and then you have people who are addressing conventional refugees and other displaced persons. But we know in reality that there is really quite a continuum between being forced to move in the sense that you literally are fleeing for your life, and people who are choosing under the best of circumstances with all of the information that they could possibly have, that they will migrate voluntarily to the best possible destination where they will make the most income that they can have, this idea that people are rational economic actors. So when we're talking about habitability, I think what we are trying to also do in talking to policy actors is to say, well, the concept of habitability helps us to bridge a bit between the person who is moving absolutely voluntarily and those people who probably would prefer to stay. And what we know from doing field research in most countries, people prefer to stay where they are. But at some point they say, well, my livelihood has been eroded to such an extent, or the crops have failed for so many seasons that I feel I should go. Can we really consider that that's a voluntary migration? That's questionable. So the concept of habitability allows us to distinguish a bit further what are the conditions in a community, and then also the individual factors like age and gender and so on that makes it such that a person considers I can stay here versus at the point that they say I can no longer be here. I hope that helps a bit, but it's certainly still a conceptual web that we're untangling and doing that through more kind of targeted multi-site qualitative research, new techniques like fuzzy cognitive mapping, where we're really honing in on people's perceptions and weighting different factors in their perceptions of why they moved, and things like that.
Thank you. We have one question online. Pallavi, do you want to ask a question?
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, so I just in similar line of thinking, Julia, in terms of the research you shared with us, and my question prior to, thank you for responding to that. And I'm just wondering in terms of how we define resilient communities when we look at the global south versus the north, and the concept of what it means to have a choice when you do migrate for better economic opportunity versus when you're forced to migrate because of climate disasters, and just seeing all the presentations that the speakers made. I'm just wondering, how much does the concept of community, like the way we understand community in terms of social resilience, play into how perhaps receiving communities can think about migrants to provide those sort of connections, if you will, for climate migrations to be successful, say maybe in the Western context, as much as I know your research doesn't necessarily tackle the Western context, but in my head, I'm trying to draw parallels between, what we heard from the theoretical research on how social resilience plays into sort of the psyche of climate migrants to, how we can successfully think about, creating, receiving communities that can provide those connections or provide increased sense of social resilience.
Thank you.
So I would just offer a couple of thoughts, and then maybe the other presenters would have something to say as well. I think that this is a really important question, and one that we haven't really dived into too much in this project that I'm presenting today. Although we did have interviews in destination areas, we just simply haven't gotten through those, and we're interested in looking at that. But what I think has at least been important from what I've seen is that people who are arriving in a community, they need to also then have a connection back home in a lot of cases. And I think that this allows for sort of what you could consider like a translocal livelihood, where the person in the destination area continues to have a connection back home. They're sending financial remittances, they're sending skills, they're sending knowledge, and they're also receiving those things back. They're also, in a lot of cases, providing political representation for the persons back home in remote areas. And if we're trying to then offer to policy actors or others solutions to how to increase and build social resilience, I think some kind of low-hanging fruit that for whatever reason is not big in the world yet is supporting the diaspora groups can be supported, because when diaspora get together, they often then support adaptation strategies in their home communities. They do this, of course, through also like philanthropy and things like that, but also just providing, connection is also really important.
We just lost your contact again. Yep. And then, of course, there's a lot of that can be, hold on. Oh, sorry, my internet is been unstable. Okay. Do you
I'm sure you got my point.
Yes, thank you. Do either of you, Amanda or Ray, have an answer to Pallavi's question?
Well, I think you speak to the tremendous diversity of communities and how they're structured and what their purposes are and what they do. And that somehow has to be taken into account in research, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how we're all kind of touching on these dichotomies of forced versus voluntary displacement, but also of a lot of the environmental justice papers will talk about, well, is it climate gentrification or is it just gentrification? And so it's really interesting when you try to disentangle these concepts and try to figure out, why are people leaving certain areas and going to others. But yeah, the hope is that they do have good receiving communities. And yeah, I think we often think of this as, there's just a great presentation in another session about internal displacement and focusing on that as a way to maybe get over othering climate migrants and thinking of people coming in from other countries, and that this is an internal to country problem as well.
Great. We have a question here in the room.
Hi, I have a question for Amanda. So you mentioned, if I don't remember wrong, you mentioned only 5% papers talk about homeless. Is it because the lack of data? And also, do you see any papers talking about like multiple events and do a comparison how that differs by different types of hazards and like a scale or severity of natural disasters?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's really the fact that a lot of papers don't engage with talking about homeless populations that are homeless prior to the disasters taking place happens for a couple reasons. And the first is that data isn't readily accessible. It's not part of the census data, but also there's a perceived and also real difficulties with studying those populations. And so it's kind of twofold, but I do think it's possible, and there is a lot of really good work being done. But then you get into barriers like getting IRB approval and getting to work with vulnerable populations, and just like barriers that are set up for very good reasons that mean that that work takes longer. It has to be more intentional. And so that's why it just hasn't been done as much as other general kind of census analysis. And then when you talk about multiple events or cascading events, I think that that ends up being a really interesting part of the literature, because when you think about environmental justice starting in the movement starting in the 70s and looking at toxic waste and pollution, and then you combine that with the idea that minority populations, marginalized populations are living in flood zones. And then we're seeing this increase of NatTech disasters or coastal hazards combined with these technological disasters as well. So that combination is talked about a lot in the literature. And you can see how there's just these overlapping issues of everything that's happening. And then also cascading disasters. That's an additional thing that I think science, everyone being in silos, has trouble really understanding what the effects of multiple disasters, cascading disasters, will be. Because you have the people who study riverine flooding versus coastal flooding versus different types of flooding. And then when you're looking from a planar perspective of what does that mean combined for a community, it can be very difficult to make that assessment.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Oh yeah, you had one back there. I'll come back to you.
Hi, everyone. Sydney Fishman, Washington Sea Grant. My question is US focused, so primarily, Amanda, it's for you, but also Ray, I feel like you might be able to chime in as well. So Amanda, I read in your abstract that part of what you were going to talk about perhaps or could speak to is recommendations at the federal level. I know you worked with some federal folks, and I work at the local to regional, state, and also with some federal folks. And so I'm wondering, Amanda, what recommendations might you have for more on the practitioner side, people who are working with communities and also with the local, state, and federal agencies that serve those communities, to take your research and make things better and do something with it? And then Ray as well, recommendations that you might have for practitioners. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sydney. Yeah, I have a history of working in federal science agencies from NOAA and USGS. And thinking about these issues within these agencies, I think has gotten a lot more difficult, especially recently with the change in administration. So I think there's a lot of ways that this literature can move forward. I mean, I've heard people talk about saying fairness instead of equity, or recently in a paper we're saying historical and cultural resources instead of environmental justice. So I think it's just important to note that while it's not going to be as easy to track this literature the way that we have in this literature review, where we just look up environmental justice, it's going to become, people are going to be using different words to describe these issues. It's still really important that this work moves forward. And yeah, from the practitioner and federal agency perspective, I think one of the benefits of being a federal agency is that you can really fix one of the key issues that I mentioned, which is this procedural dimension of environmental justice, where folks are not being included in these processes. And so when you're NOAA, when you're USGS, when you're FEMA, there's a lot that you can do to solve that part of the problem and make sure that you're talking to those communities and that people are being involved. And so that's just a key element of this in a real way, that there can be, some more transformative change and solutions.
Yeah, and I think what was just highlighted about the sector-specific, barriers is really a problem in integrating all of these things, either within the behavioral element, between behaviors and natural hazards, et cetera. And cascading effects, especially what was just mentioned, the compound effects. There are real barriers that are preventing the work from being used. And we have to overcome that. We're beginning to, though.
Great, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I found it interesting that all three presentations seem to present a model underlying which was more complex than, or you were positing some lack of complexity in what you were looking at and the need to be more complex in defining the causes and drivers in this social environmental systems in relationship to movement or migration, and also some lack of attention or need to focus on justice, in your case, Amanda, or habitability or resilience. And so I guess my question is, what do you think the implications of kind of recognizing the complex systems and the need for integration among these components, or the need to focus on the underlying justice outcomes or habitability? What are the implications of that, both for your own work and for us as practicing researchers? And some of you have already touched on that. I think Julia was raising that in some of her comments about public policy.
I know my co-panelists will have a lot to say about this as well, but I mean, I think there's complexity, but there's also just specificity. And that's one of the main points I'm making of, just being really specific in which issues you're talking about and how it's affecting people, and if there's a difference between climate gentrification or gentrification, making sure you're spelling out what that difference is. But to your broader point of how do we do this complex work, and I mean, I'll say what I say in almost every presentation is that there needs to be better communication across scientists, across agencies, across community organizations that are doing this work, and more platforms. I mean, I think this conference is a really great example of how we have researchers and practitioners and folks in agencies and consultancy groups all learning from each other and working together and in the same room. And I don't see this happening outside of conferences like this. So I think we need a lot more spaces to have these types of conversations.
And I think certainly the communication is key, but we need the models actually to be incorporating each of the dimensions. And I hate to say, the social psychologists, scientists seem to be leading, crossing, integrating the behavioral elements across hazards. And we just need that work to be done.
And Julia, you might have the last word since we're approaching the top of the hour.
Sure. I mean, thank you so much for the question. I think it's really key. And I would echo a bit what's been said in the room that I think, oh, sorry, maybe I'll just turn off my video, my internet. In Germany, the internet's not that great sometimes. I think we need to cross hands a lot more in different policy areas, because these are, of course, issues that, as has been said, cut a lot of different issues. We see in all countries in the world, really, that there are silos between the people who work on climate change adaptation, the people who work on disaster risk reduction, and the people who work on, actually humanitarian response, and then eventually integrating migrants and displaced persons into communities. So more multi-stakeholder conversations, and think in some areas it may make sense to have kind of an executive committee at the cabinet level that can bring people together to talk about this and bring the science more into the policy sphere.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're, if there's a burning question left in the room, we have time for it, or is there one online?
One more.
Okay, here, go ahead.
We do have one online.
Okay.
Similar to the last question, or I guess 2 questions ago now, in the US, there's been a major shift in the federal government leadership and funding on all climate issues except migration. Based on your learning, are there local, parentheses, community or sub-community level, or regional strategies emerging that residents can use to build power for their own readiness and social resilience and use that to support justice efforts?
Is that directed to someone in particular, or? to all of them. Would anyone like to take that on? I think Amanda and Ray, or maybe someone in the room has an answer to that.
I mean, it's really interesting in the US, looking state by state on how these different efforts are being supported or not supported. There were, some great bills in California that almost got passed, thinking about how to, fund some of these issues and help people relocate to other areas that might be less hazardous. But yeah, it remains to be seen how this is going to move forward politically, and hopefully we can continue providing the science and the research that supports what will be the best efforts.
I agree. We'll have to see. We keep seeing a back and forth about policy and what's being supported or not. Things are dribbling through, as I can see. We're still having a lot of NOAA data collection. It's just sort of under the radar to some extent, and there is research still being done, but we're going to have to see how it plays out.
All right, on that ambiguous note, I guess, ambivalent note, let me just maybe say one of the takeaways from all your presentations for me is that, we don't talk apparently about the deep drivers behind environmental injustice in these papers. And we don't talk about that context apparently doesn't seem to change one bit in terms of where people go next, wherever they arrive, whether that's, in other countries like Julia was presenting to us, or whether it's here in the US. We're still in the same, colonial, patriarchal, racist context, right? Capitalist context. So really interesting questions for me that raises in terms of how do we rebuild, or maybe build for the first time, a whole different kind of social resilience for our societies as we get on the move. So thank you, everyone, all your presentations and your contributions, questions. So now I invite you to go to coffee and then the plenary in the forum. Thank you all for being here.